Most NFL controversies begin with a confrontation, a heated exchange on the sideline, a frustrated post on social media, a leaked locker room story that spreads through the media before anyone can verify what really happened. But this story was different. This story started with 6 silent seconds that somehow managed to capture the attention of the entire football world. No shouting, no argument, no dramatic scene, just a veteran wide receiver extending his hand and a young quarterback continuing to walk as though the gesture never happened. Under normal circumstances, nobody would care. Players miss handshakes every day. Teammates pass each other without stopping all the time. Yet within minutes of the footage appearing online, fans, analysts, former players, and media personalities were dissecting every frame. They weren't discussing what happened during the interaction, they were discussing what it meant. Because the moment felt too deliberate, too symbolic, and too connected to everything that had happened before it to simply be dismissed as an accident. The quarterback at the center of that storm was Shedeur Sanders, the young signal caller who entered the NFL carrying one of the most debated reputations in recent memory, suddenly found himself at the center of another national conversation. The video itself lasted only a few seconds. Jeudy extended his hand, Shedeur kept moving. That was it. No explanation followed, no statement was released, no emotional reaction was offered to satisfy the endless demand for answers that exists in modern sports media. But sometimes silence creates a bigger reaction than words ever could. The clip spread across social media platforms at an incredible speed because everyone immediately recognized that they were not watching a random interaction between teammates. They were watching the latest chapter of a story that had been quietly developing for months inside the Cleveland Browns organization. A story involving trust, respect, frustration, expectations, and a young quarterback who seemed increasingly determined to let his performance speak louder than anything else. What made the timing even more fascinating was that the viral handshake moment wasn't the biggest development happening inside the Browns facility that day. While social media focused on 6 seconds of footage, a much larger battle was unfolding in real time. The quarterback competition that many observers believed had already been decided suddenly looked completely different. Reporters who had spent weeks discussing one outcome were beginning to change their tone. Coaches were making comments that sounded very different from what fans had heard earlier in the offseason. Practice performances were forcing difficult conversations inside the organization. And at the center of all those developments was the same player who had just become the most talked about person on football timelines across the country. The more people looked at the timing of everything, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that all of these events were connected. That's why reducing this story to a simple handshake completely misses the bigger picture. The handshake wasn't the story, it was a symbol. It was a moment that caused fans to revisit months of history and ask questions that had never fully been answered. Why had tensions appeared to develop between certain players? Why did some interactions seem to carry more emotion than others? Why were media narratives suddenly shifting after weeks of certainty? And perhaps most importantly, why did it feel like the momentum surrounding Shedeur Sanders was growing stronger with every passing week? Those questions transformed a 6-second clip into one of the most discussed moments of the offseason because people instinctively understood that they were watching something larger than a missed handshake. They were watching the latest chapter of a story that had been quietly developing for months inside the Cleveland Browns organization. A story involving trust, respect, frustration, expectations, and a young quarterback who seemed increasingly determined to let his performance speak louder than anything else. The most interesting part of all is that nobody can fully understand what happened during those 6 seconds without understanding everything that happened before them. The viral clip was not the beginning of this story, it was the payoff. It was the moment when months of frustrations, observations, debates, and unanswered questions suddenly collided in front of a camera. By the time that footage reached the internet, the foundation had already been built, the relationships had already been tested, the narratives had already been established, the doubts had already been expressed, and the performances that would change everything had already begun.
What looked like a simple walk past an outstretched hand was actually the final visible piece of a much larger puzzle. And once the full timeline is laid out from beginning to end, the meaning behind that moment becomes far more interesting than anyone could have imagined when they first watched the clip.
Long before the handshake clip went viral, long before reporters started changing their opinions, and long before fans began debating whether Shedeur Sanders was quietly taking control of the Browns quarterback competition, there was another moment that many people still haven't forgotten. In fact, if you ask a large portion of Browns fans why the recent handshake video exploded the way it did, they'll point directly back to this incident. Because for many viewers, the viral walk past Jerry Jeudy wasn't the beginning of the story. It was a response to something they had already seen happen months earlier. To understand why so many people reacted the way they did, you have to go back to a frustrating afternoon during the regular season when cameras captured something that immediately made football fans uncomfortable. The Browns were struggling. The offense was having one of those ugly days that every team experiences at some point during an NFL season. Mistakes were piling up, momentum was disappearing, emotions were naturally running high. But what happened on the sidelines stood out because it wasn't directed at a veteran star making millions of dollars. It wasn't aimed at an established starter with years of experience. It was aimed at a young quarterback still trying to find his footing at the professional level. At that point, Shedeur Sanders was still attempting to establish himself inside the organization. He wasn't viewed as the future face of the franchise by everyone. He wasn't receiving the kind of praise he's getting today. He was simply a young quarterback trying to prove he belonged. Every throw was being analyzed, every mistake was being magnified, every decision was being questioned. That's the reality for most young quarterbacks entering the NFL, especially those carrying the level of attention that followed Sanders from college. Then came the sideline interaction that immediately sparked debate. Cameras showed Jerry Jeudy visibly frustrated during a discussion involving the rookie quarterback. The images spread quickly because fans interpreted the body language in dramatically different ways. Some viewed it as normal, competitive frustration. Others saw something more concerning. Regardless of where people stood, one thing was undeniable. The moment became a national talking point almost instantly. Sports shows discussed it, social media dissected it, former players weighed in, and suddenly what should have been an ordinary sideline conversation became one of the most memorable visual moments of the Browns season. What really captured people's attention wasn't just the confrontation itself, it was the contrast in how both individuals handled the aftermath. In today's sports world, often disagreements lead to follow-up comments, social media responses, leaked reports, or subtle attempts to explain one side of the story. Fans have become accustomed to athletes defending themselves publicly whenever controversy appears. That's why Shedeur's response surprised so many people. Instead of escalating the situation, he appeared determined to move beyond it. There was no public campaign to win sympathy, no attempt to embarrass anyone, no emotional reaction designed to generate headlines. He simply continued preparing for the next opportunity. Whether people agreed with his approach or not, many observers viewed it as a level of maturity they weren't expecting from a young player dealing with national scrutiny. The contrast became impossible to ignore. One side of the story generated noise, the other side generated curiosity. As weeks passed, that sideline incident should have faded away like most NFL controversies eventually do. The league moves fast, new stories emerge every day, fans usually shift their attention to the next headline within hours. But this particular incident lingered. Every time Sanders stepped onto the field, some fans remembered it. Every time discussions about leadership, chemistry, or trust surfaced, people referenced it. It became one of those moments that quietly remained in the background while the season continued moving forward. And the reason it stayed alive was simple. Nobody ever felt like the underlying questions had been answered. Why had emotions reached that point? What did it reveal about relationships inside the locker room? And perhaps most importantly, how would Sanders respond over the long term? Because in professional sports, the most powerful responses rarely happen during interviews, they happen through performance. What nobody realized at the time was that the sideline incident would eventually become the foundation for an entirely different conversation months later.
The handshake clip that shocked the internet didn't exist in isolation. It carried baggage, it carried history, it carried the memory of a previous moment that millions of football fans had already witnessed. That's why reactions were so intense when the footage resurfaced. People weren't judging 6 seconds of video, they were connecting those 6 seconds to everything they remembered from before. The viral moment felt significant because many viewers believed they were watching the continuation of a story that never truly ended. And as it turns out, that was only the beginning, because once fans started looking deeper into the timeline, they discovered something even more interesting. The questions surrounding that sideline confrontation weren't disappearing, they were multiplying. And the next chapter would make those questions impossible to ignore.
The reason the original sideline incident refused to disappear wasn't because fans were obsessed with drama. It wasn't because people wanted conflict. It was because the more they watched the season unfold, the more they began noticing something that made them uncomfortable. A pattern. Not a proven fact, not something anyone inside the organization publicly acknowledged, just a series of observations that sparked increasingly difficult questions. And once fans started asking those questions, they couldn't stop. Because what initially looked like an isolated emotional moment slowly began appearing as part of a much larger picture. The discussion was no longer focused on what happened during one frustrating game. The discussion became why that frustration seemed to surface in one situation and not in others. That's when the debate surrounding Jeudy and Shedeur Sanders took on an entirely different life of its own. The internet can be many things, but one thing it rarely misses is inconsistency. Fans watch every snap. They remember every reaction. They compare situations that teams and media members often preferred to discuss separately. Throughout the following weeks, clips, screenshots, and game situations were being revisited by people attempting to understand the bigger story. What caught their attention wasn't necessarily what happened between Jeudy and Sanders, it was what didn't happen in other situations. Fans began pointing to moments involving different quarterbacks, different mistakes, and different circumstances. They noticed that frustrations which appeared highly visible in one situation didn't seem to receive the same public expression elsewhere. Whether those observations were fair or unfair became a matter of intense debate, but the debate itself was impossible to ignore because it was growing louder with every passing week. That's when online discussions started taking a more controversial turn. Some fans suggested that Sanders was being held to a different standard than other quarterbacks. Others argued that people were reading far too much into isolated moments and creating narratives that didn't exist. Social media became divided into camps. One side insisted that football is an emotional sport and emotional reactions happen all the time. The other side argued that leadership requires consistency, regardless of circumstances. Neither side was willing to back down. And because neither side could definitively prove its position, the discussion continued gaining momentum. What made the situation especially fascinating was that the controversy wasn't being fueled by new incidents, it was being fueled by memory. Every new conversation brought fans back to the same question they had been asking for months. Why did this situation feel different? Rumors and speculation naturally followed. Some fans claimed there was tension behind the scenes. Others suggested there was professional jealousy involved. It's important to note that these remained fan theories and online speculation rather than verified facts. No credible evidence ever emerged publicly proving those claims. But in today's sports landscape, perception often becomes a story of its own. When enough people begin asking the same question, the question itself becomes part of the narrative. That's exactly what happened here. The conversation evolved beyond a disagreement between teammates and became a larger discussion about trust, respect, and accountability within a professional locker room. Every new performance, every interview, and every interaction was suddenly being viewed through that lens. What made the situation even more interesting was how Sanders handled the growing noise. Most young athletes facing this level of attention eventually respond. Some defend themselves publicly, others push back through interviews or social media. Sanders largely refused to do either.
Instead, he continued focusing on football. That approach created a vacuum, and vacuums in sports media rarely stay empty for long. Fans filled the silence with theories, analysts filled it with opinions, content creators filled it with debates, yet Sanders himself remained largely focused on preparation and performance. Whether that was intentional or simply his personality, it had a powerful effect. The less he said, the more people paid attention to what he did. And then something unexpected happened. The football itself started changing the conversation. Suddenly, people weren't just talking about relationships, body language, or locker room dynamics. They were talking about performance. They were talking about growth. They were talking about a young quarterback who appeared to be improving faster than many expected. The same fans who had spent months debating sideline interactions were now beginning to notice something far more important taking place on the field. Because while the arguments about trust continued in the background, the results were beginning to speak for themselves. And once that happened, the entire discussion surrounding Shedeur Sanders entered a completely different phase. The questions were no longer just about how teammates viewed him. The questions were becoming much bigger than that.
The reason the conversation eventually shifted away from rumors, body language, and locker room theories is because football has a way of forcing reality into the spotlight. You can debate intentions, you can argue about personalities, you can speculate about relationships behind closed doors, but eventually, the game itself takes over. Eventually, players have to perform, and when that happened, the entire discussion surrounding Shedeur Sanders started changing. Slowly at first, then all at once. Because while fans were busy arguing about sideline incidents and social media reactions, Sanders was doing something far more important. He was giving people football reasons to pay attention. Not emotional reasons, not controversial reasons. Football reasons. And in the NFL, those are the reasons that matter most. One of the biggest mistakes people make when evaluating young quarterbacks is assuming development happens in a straight line. It doesn't. Growth happens in bursts. Confidence arrives unexpectedly. Momentum can shift in a matter of weeks. Early in his professional journey, Sanders was viewed by many as a developmental project, a talented player, certainly, but not necessarily someone expected to force his way into major conversations so quickly. The narrative was already written. The Browns had veterans, they had established names, they had players with higher draft status and more organizational investment. Sanders was supposed to learn, wait his turn, and slowly climb the ladder. That was the expectation. The problem for everyone who believed that narrative was simple. Sanders didn't seem interested in following the script. As opportunities began appearing, the flashes became harder to ignore. Coaches noticed them, teammates noticed them, reporters covering practice noticed them, and eventually fans noticed them too. The throws were becoming sharper, the decision-making looked more confident, the command of the offense appeared to be growing. Every week seemed to produce another moment that forced people to reconsider their previous assumptions. Suddenly, discussions that once centered around potential were becoming discussions about production. Instead of asking whether Sanders belonged, people were beginning to ask how quickly he was closing the gap between himself and players who were supposedly far ahead of him on the depth chart. At the same time, another storyline was unfolding that added even more fuel to the debate. While Sanders was gaining momentum, questions surrounding Jeudy's production were becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. Football is ultimately a results business. Expectations are tied to performance. The higher the salary, the bigger the expectations become. The more experience a player has, the less patience fans tend to have for repeated mistakes. Fair or unfair, that's the reality of professional sports. Every dropped pass gets replayed. Every missed opportunity gets discussed. Every mistake becomes part of a larger evaluation. And when fans started comparing what they were seeing from Sanders with what they were seeing from some of the veterans around them, the contrast became impossible to ignore. This is where the conversation became uncomfortable for a lot of people, because once performance enters the equation, narratives become much harder to control. Fans began pointing to situations where Sanders appeared to be doing exactly what a young quarterback is supposed to do. He was improving, he was learning, he was earning trust. Meanwhile, some of the players expected to be helping accelerate that growth were facing criticism of their own.
Suddenly, the old assumptions about who deserved patience and who deserved scrutiny began flipping. The rookie quarterback, who was once viewed as the uncertain piece of the puzzle, was starting to look increasingly stable. The veterans, who were expected to provide certainty, were becoming the subjects of criticism. That reversal changed everything. Then came the outside voices. In the NFL, criticism from fans can be dismissed. Criticism from social media can be ignored. But when respected former players begin publicly evaluating a situation, people listen. Analysts started discussing whether certain expectations matched actual production. Former receivers weighed in on receiver play. Former quarterbacks discussed quarterback development. The more experienced football minds examined the situation, the more the conversation moved away from emotions and toward accountability. Nobody was talking about potential locker room drama anymore. They were talking about execution, consistency, reliability, the core traits that determine who earns trust inside a football organization. And that's when Shedeur's greatest strength started becoming obvious. It wasn't his arm talent, it wasn't his confidence, it wasn't even his growing popularity among fans. It was the fact that he kept giving people new evidence. Every time the conversation threatened to become entirely about controversy, he redirected it back toward football. Every strong practice, every positive report, every sign of growth added another layer to the case being built around him. People who initially dismissed him as a long-term project were beginning to realize that the timeline might be moving much faster than expected. The player they thought would spend years trying to prove himself was suddenly forcing his way into conversations happening right now.
The most fascinating part is that this shift wasn't happening only among fans. It was beginning to happen inside media circles as well. Reporters who had spent weeks repeating one narrative were starting to sound less certain. Analysts who once viewed the quarterback competition through a specific lens were beginning to acknowledge new possibilities. The evidence was becoming too difficult to ignore. Something was changing. And once that realization started spreading, an even bigger development followed. Because while fans were noticing Sanders' growth on the field, people inside the building appeared to be noticing it too. And when those internal evaluations started changing, the entire offseason narrative surrounding the Browns' quarterback situation was about to be turned upside down. For weeks, the story seemed settled. Not officially settled, of course, because no NFL team is going to announce a winner of a quarterback competition before it absolutely has to. But in the media world, there was a growing sense that the picture had already been painted. Certain names were viewed as safer, certain veterans were viewed as more likely options, certain outcomes were discussed so frequently that they began sounding less like predictions and more like expectations. That's how narratives work in professional sports. They start as possibilities. Then they get repeated enough times that people begin treating them as probabilities. Eventually, those probabilities become assumptions. And once assumptions take hold, it becomes incredibly difficult to change people's minds. The problem for everyone who had already decided how the Browns' quarterback situation would unfold was that reality had other plans. The first signs of trouble appeared quietly. They weren't dramatic headlines or shocking announcements. They were subtle shifts in language, small adjustments in tone. Reporters who once sounded completely certain suddenly sounded slightly less confident. Analysts who previously viewed the competition through a narrow lens started acknowledging alternative outcomes. The change wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable, and whenever multiple media voices begin adjusting their position at the same time, it usually means something is happening behind the scenes. Reporters don't typically abandon narratives they've spent weeks promoting without a reason. Something had changed. The question was what? What made the shift so fascinating was that nobody could point to one single event. There wasn't a blockbuster trade. There wasn't an injury that reshaped the competition overnight. There wasn't a public announcement from the coaching staff. Instead, the change seemed to come from a collection of observations that kept pointing in the same direction. Every practice report appeared a little more favorable. Every update from the facility seemed to include another positive mention. Every discussion about quarterback development kept bringing the same name back into the conversation. At first, people dismissed it as off-season hype. Then they dismissed it as media overreaction. Eventually, it became impossible to dismiss it all. The most interesting part was watching how quickly certainty disappeared.
Just weeks earlier, many discussions surrounding the quarterback room sounded almost predetermined. Fans were being told who had the experience, who had the organizational investment, who had the inside track. The hierarchy seemed obvious. Then, suddenly, the same people who had spent weeks discussing that hierarchy were beginning to acknowledge that the situation might not be nearly as clear as they originally believed. That's when fans started paying very close attention, because media narratives don't collapse unless the evidence supporting them starts breaking apart, and that's exactly what appeared to be happening. The reason this mattered so much wasn't because reporters changed their opinions. Reporters do that all the time. The reason it mattered was because of what the change suggested. If people with access to practices, coaches, and team sources were adjusting their expectations, then it likely meant that the evaluations inside the building were evolving as well. That's what made the story impossible to ignore. The conversation was no longer centered around fan optimism or internet speculation. It was moving into a completely different category. The possibility that decision-makers themselves were seeing something they hadn't anticipated a few months earlier. For Shedeur Sanders, this represented one of the biggest turning points of the entire offseason. Up until that point, many discussions about him centered around potential. People talked about what he might become. They discussed his future. They debated his ceiling. Suddenly, the language changed. The focus shifted from what he could eventually accomplish to what he was doing right now. That's a massive difference. NFL organizations can afford patience with potential. They become much more interested when performance starts accelerating the timeline, and that's exactly what seemed to be happening. Every positive report added pressure to the old narrative. Every strong showing created another crack in the assumptions that had dominated the conversation for months. What made the collapse even more dramatic was how quickly momentum appeared to build once it started. Sports are filled with examples of players who spend months fighting for attention before suddenly becoming impossible to ignore. One strong week becomes two become three. Before anyone realizes what's happening, the discussion surrounding that player is completely different than it was at the beginning of the season. Sanders seemed to be entering that phase. The questions were changing. The expectations were changing. Even the skepticism was changing. People who once doubted whether he belonged in the conversation were beginning to debate how high he might climb within it.
And then came the moment that truly accelerated everything. Because while fans were noticing changes in media coverage and analysts were beginning to reconsider their positions, someone inside the organization delivered comments that carried far more weight than any report or opinion ever could. A coach. A voice directly connected to the evaluation process. Someone whose words couldn't simply be dismissed as speculation. And when those comments finally arrived, they didn't just weaken the existing narrative, they threatened to destroy it entirely. Suddenly, the quarterback competition looked more open than it had at any point during the offseason. Suddenly, assumptions that once felt safe no longer felt safe at all. And for the first time, people began seriously considering the possibility that Shedeur Sanders wasn't just participating in the competition, he might actually be changing it. There are certain moments during an NFL offseason when a coach walks up to a podium, answers a routine question, and nobody remembers a single word he said 24 hours later. Then, there are moments that completely alter the direction of a conversation. Moments when one answer quietly destroys weeks of assumptions without anyone fully realizing it at first. That's exactly what happened when the Browns coaching staff addressed the quarterback situation after a stretch of practices that had already begun generating serious attention. On the surface, the comments sounded measured, professional, and completely reasonable. There was no dramatic declaration, no announcement naming a starter, no guarantee about who would ultimately win the job. But if you listened carefully, the language coming from inside the building sounded very different from the narrative that had been dominating the public conversation. For months, the discussion surrounding the quarterback room had followed a familiar script. Experience mattered, contracts mattered, organizational investments mattered. Fans heard endless debates about why certain players supposedly had advantages that others couldn't overcome. It was the kind of logic that makes perfect sense until performance starts interfering with it.
The deeper the offseason progressed, the more difficult it became to ignore what was happening on the practice field. Every positive report involving Shedeur Sanders added another layer of pressure to the existing narrative. Every strong session forced another uncomfortable question. If the competition was already decided, why did so many reports keep highlighting the same player? If the hierarchy was already established, why were people inside the organization continuing to evaluate everything so closely? Those questions continued building until they eventually reached the coaching staff's podium. What made the coach's comments so important wasn't what he said about one quarterback, it was what he refused to say. Sports fans are used to reading between the lines because coaches rarely reveal everything they're thinking. In many cases, what isn't said matters just as much as what is. That's why people immediately focused on the absence of certainty. There was no declaration that one player had separated himself from the pack. There was no indication that the competition was merely a formality. Instead, the message sounded like something entirely different. It sounded like a genuine evaluation process that was still unfolding. It sounded like coaches who were seeing enough positive developments to keep every option on the table. And for people who had spent weeks hearing that the quarterback race already had a clear direction, that was a massive development. The reaction was immediate because the comments created a problem for anyone still trying to defend the old narrative. If a coach directly involved in evaluating the quarterbacks wasn't willing to treat the competition as settled, why should anyone else? Suddenly, analysts who spoke confidently about the depth chart were forced to become more cautious. Reporters who previously framed the situation one way started acknowledging additional possibilities. The certainty that once surrounded the conversation began evaporating. And once certainty disappears in professional sports, momentum becomes incredibly powerful. Because momentum doesn't just influence fans, it influences discussions, it influences expectations, and sometimes it even influences the pressure surrounding organizational decisions. What made this moment particularly fascinating was the tone behind the comments. Coaches can sound worried, they can sound frustrated, they can sound like they're searching for answers. This didn't feel like any of those situations. Instead, there was a noticeable sense of optimism, a sense of excitement, the kind of excitement coaches display when they realize they may have more talent at a position than they originally anticipated. That's what caught people's attention. The conversation wasn't framed around problems, it wasn't framed around limitations, it was framed around possibilities. And when a coaching staff starts discussing possibilities instead of concerns, people tend to notice.
For Shedeur Sanders, that shift represented perhaps the strongest validation of his entire offseason. Not because it guaranteed anything, not because it made him the starter, not because it ended the competition. In reality, it did none of those things. What it did do was something arguably more important. It legitimized the conversation. It transformed discussions about Sanders from fan-driven optimism into a serious football topic. No longer could critics dismiss the growing attention as social media hype or off-season overreaction. The coaching staff itself was now signaling that the situation deserved to be taken seriously, and once that happened, the spotlight grew even brighter. The most remarkable part is how quickly everything began accelerating afterward. Positive practice reports carried more weight. Every highlight became a bigger story. Every update from camp attracted more attention. It felt as though the entire football world was suddenly watching the same competition through a completely different lens. What at once looked like a predictable off-season storyline was turning into one of the most intriguing quarterback battles in the league. The assumptions that existed at the beginning of the spring were rapidly losing their influence. New evidence was replacing old expectations, and the player at the center of that transformation continued doing the same thing he had been doing all along, showing up, competing, and giving people more reasons to reconsider what they thought they knew. Then came the moment that pushed the conversation beyond football analysis into something much bigger.
a 6-second interaction that instantly became one of the most viral clips of the offseason, a moment that seemed insignificant to some people and deeply meaningful to others, a moment that brought months of tension, speculation, performance, and shifting narratives crashing together at exactly the same time. Because by the time the handshake clip appeared online, it wasn't being viewed through the eyes of people who knew nothing about the story. It was being viewed through the eyes of fans who had been watching this entire journey unfold. And that's why the reaction was so explosive. The handshake wasn't creating a narrative. In many ways, it was confirming one. By the time the handshake clip finally reached social media, something fascinating happened. People weren't watching it as a 6-second video, they were watching it as the conclusion to a story they had been following for months. That's why the reaction was so strong. If the clip had surfaced in isolation, it probably would have disappeared within a few hours. Fans might have debated whether it was intentional, laughed about it for a day, and moved on. But context changes everything, and in this case, the context was impossible to ignore. The earlier sideline confrontation, the questions about consistency, the growing support for Shedeur Sanders, the shifting media narrative, the positive reports coming from practice, all of it was sitting in the background when that footage appeared. Suddenly, what looked like a simple walk past a teammate became one of the most discussed moments of the entire offseason. The most interesting part wasn't what happened in the clip, it was what people projected onto it. Some viewers immediately interpreted the moment as disrespect, others saw it as professionalism. Some argued that Sanders was holding a grudge, others believed he was simply choosing where to invest his energy. The same 6 seconds produced completely different conclusions depending on who was watching. That's usually a sign that a moment has become symbolic. It stops being about the literal action and starts representing something larger. In this case, the handshake became a symbol of trust, or perhaps more accurately, a symbol of the question that had followed this entire story from the beginning. Who does Shedeur Sanders trust, and who has earned the right to receive that trust? That question matters because Sanders himself had already provided a clue months earlier. Throughout the various ups and downs of the season, one theme continued appearing whenever he discussed teammates, preparation, or relationships: trust. Not talent, not popularity, not reputation. Trust. The word kept resurfacing. It became one of the defining themes surrounding his approach to football. Trust in preparation, trust in teammates, trust in people who consistently show up and do their job. Whether fans agreed with his approach or not, it was a philosophy that appeared remarkably consistent. And when people revisited those earlier comments after watching the handshake clip, they began connecting dots. Maybe fairly, maybe unfairly, but they connected them nonetheless. What made the moment resonate so strongly was that it felt authentic. In modern sports, fans have become skeptical of everything. Carefully crafted social media posts, public relations statements, perfectly timed interviews. People are constantly searching for what feels real. The handshake clip felt real. There was no camera setup, no planned announcement, no attempt to create a headline. In fact, the reason the clip exploded was because it appeared completely unfiltered. It looked like a genuine interaction captured in passing. Whether viewers approved of the decision or criticized it, most agreed on one thing: it didn't feel staged, and authenticity is incredibly powerful in today's sports landscape.
Another reason the clip gained so much traction is because it revealed how dramatically perceptions surrounding Sanders have changed. Think about where the conversation was not that long ago. Much of the attention surrounding him focused on his draft position, the criticism he received entering the league, and the doubts surrounding his future. He was viewed by many as a developmental player trying to prove he belonged. The viral handshake moment told a completely different story. People weren't discussing whether Sanders belonged anymore. They were discussing whether he had become influential enough to make statements without saying a single word. That's a remarkable transformation. It signals a shift in status, a shift in confidence, a shift in how both fans and media perceive a player.
Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire situation is that Sanders never appeared interested in explaining himself. He didn't launch into a lengthy defense, he didn't hold a press conference to clarify his intentions, he didn't jump onto social media to tell everyone what they should think. He simply continued doing what he had been doing throughout the offseason, practicing, competing, improving. That silence forced everyone else to fill in the blanks themselves, and when people are left to interpret events on their own, they often reveal more about their own beliefs than they do about the person they're discussing. Some saw confidence, others saw pettiness. Some saw maturity, others saw stubbornness. The clip became a mirror reflecting whatever perspective viewers already carried into the conversation. But there was another layer to this story that many people missed. The handshake wasn't just about a past relationship, it was also about the future. While everyone was focused on what Sanders may or may not have been saying to Jeudy, something important was happening elsewhere on the field. New connections were forming, new chemistry was developing, new trust was being built, and that may be the most important detail of all. Because in football, trust isn't measured by handshakes, it's measured by repetitions, it's measured by preparation, it's measured by who shows up when the game is on the line. The real story wasn't necessarily about who Sanders walked past, the real story might have been about who he was running toward. And that's where this entire narrative takes another unexpected turn. Because while the football world obsessed over one brief interaction, a completely different development was unfolding in practice, one that may have a far greater impact on the Browns' future than any viral clip ever could. As the spotlight remained fixed on the handshake, a new group of players was quietly earning Sanders' confidence, and what happened next may explain why the momentum surrounding him continues to grow stronger with every passing week. While the football world spent days debating a handshake, arguing about body language, and dissecting 6 seconds of video frame by frame, something much more important was happening on the practice field. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. Everyone was focused on one relationship that appeared strained, while overlooking several new relationships that were growing stronger every single day. Because regardless of what anyone believes about the Jeudy situation, the reality is that quarterbacks do not survive in the NFL by looking backward. They survive by building trust with the players around them. They survive by creating chemistry. They survive by identifying which teammates consistently show up, execute their assignments, and make life easier when the pressure rises. And as the offseason progressed, it became increasingly clear that Sanders was finding those players. One of the most noticeable developments coming out of camp was the growing connection between Sanders and some of the younger receivers fighting to establish themselves. Unlike veteran players whose reputations are already established, younger receivers enter every practice with something to prove. Every route matters, every catch matters, every rep is another opportunity to climb the depth chart. That creates a different type of urgency, a different type of focus, and perhaps most importantly for a quarterback, it creates reliability. The reports coming out of camp consistently pointed toward the same trend. Sanders wasn't just throwing passes, he was building chemistry. Certain receivers kept appearing in positive practice reports. Certain names kept surfacing whenever coaches and observers discussed standout moments. And the more those names appeared, the more obvious the pattern became. What makes trust so valuable in football is that it cannot be manufactured. Coaches can't force it. Reporters can't create it. Social media certainly can't invent it. Trust is built through repetition. It's built when a receiver runs the correct route even when nobody is watching. It's built when a player makes a difficult catch in practice for the 10th consecutive time. It's built when a quarterback knows exactly where his receiver will be before the receiver even gets there. Those connections take time, but once they begin forming, they become incredibly powerful. That's why so many successful quarterbacks throughout NFL history eventually develop preferred targets. It's not always about talent alone. It's about predictability. It's about confidence. It's about knowing that when the moment arrives, somebody will be exactly where they're supposed to be.
The reports surrounding Sanders suggested that these types of connections were beginning to emerge. Young receivers were making plays, deep balls were connecting, timing appeared sharper, practice highlights started circulating. More importantly, the conversations surrounding those highlights sounded increasingly consistent. People weren't describing isolated flashes anymore. They were describing developing chemistry. That's a significant difference. One great throw can happen by accident, one impressive catch can be a coincidence, but when the same players keep appearing together in positive reports week after week, observers begin paying attention. That's when chemistry starts becoming part of a story. What's fascinating is how perfectly this development aligns with everything Sanders has publicly said throughout his football journey. Whenever he discusses leadership, preparation, or relationships, he repeatedly returns to the same concept: trust. Not friendship, not popularity, not status. Trust. That distinction matters because trust doesn't care about contracts or draft positions. Trust doesn't care how long a player has been in the league. Trust is earned through performance. Every practice becomes an opportunity to build it. Every successful rep becomes another brick in the foundation. And based on everything emerging from Browns practices, it appears that several young players have been earning exactly that from their quarterback. This is where the story becomes bigger than any disagreement or viral moment. The NFL is filled with talented players. What separates successful offenses from disappointing ones is usually not talent alone. It's connection, it's timing, it's chemistry. It's the confidence that develops when players spend enough time working together that they begin anticipating each other's movements without hesitation. The most dangerous offenses in football often look effortless because trust eliminates uncertainty. Quarterbacks stop second-guessing, receivers stop hesitating. Everyone operates faster because everyone believes the person next to them will do their job. That's the environment every team is trying to create. And according to the growing number of positive reports surrounding Sanders, that process may already be underway. What makes this particularly significant is that it shifts the conversation away from controversy and back toward football. The handshake became viral because it was dramatic. The developing chemistry between Sanders and his receivers matters because it could actually influence wins and losses. One creates headlines, the other creates results. And if you're the Browns coaching staff, there's no debate about which one matters more. Coaches don't care about social media narratives. They care about execution. They care about timing. They care about who consistently performs when opportunities arise. If certain receivers are developing stronger connections with their quarterback, those relationships will eventually become impossible to ignore, regardless of what anyone says publicly. And that's why this entire story feels like it's moving towards something much larger than a single off-season controversy. Because the more closely people examine what's happening inside the Browns organization, the clearer it becomes that the conversation has evolved. This is no longer about whether Sanders belongs. It's no longer about whether he can compete. It's no longer about whether he deserves attention. Those debates are fading. A new question is beginning to take their place. If these connections continue growing, if the momentum continues building, and if the confidence surrounding Sanders keeps expanding at its current pace, how much longer can anyone realistically view him as merely a developmental project? Because the signs emerging from practice suggest something very different. They suggest a player who may be moving much faster than anyone expected. And once you step back and look at the entire picture, that possibility becomes impossible to ignore.